Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Kafner Research Council webinar series. We are nearing the end of the spring semester. I believe this is our 7th webinar of this semester. Before I formally introduce our speakers for today's webinar, I would like to say a few words about the Kafner Research Council, or CRC. You've heard it a number of times, but I'm going to repeat it. So we formalized the Kafner Research Council about 3 years ago as an advisory council that would advise my office, that is the Kafner Office of Research. We do have faculty from every division represented on the council. We also have staff, graduate student, and postdoc representation. The webinar is an example of some of the activities of the council, in addition to providing advice to me and my office. They also organize the annual Kafner Research Symposium, help make decisions regarding several research-related awards in Kafner, and funding opportunities from my office, like the Joy of Discovery Seed Grant Program and the recently announced Matching Assistantship Program. When they help make important decisions in the Office of Research, they are representing you. In other words, CRC plays an important role in shared governance in our college. With that, let me briefly introduce our speakers. So Dr. Rob Myers is the director of the MU Center for Regenerative Agriculture and an adjunct faculty member with the Plant Science and Technology Division. He also serves as Regional Director of Extension Programs for the USDA NIFA North Central Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program, a role he has been in since 2010. His professional expertise encompasses sustainable and regenerative agriculture, soil health, conservation, and cropping system diversification. His PhD and master's degrees in agronomy are from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Kelly Wilson is the Assistant Director of the Center for Regenerative Agriculture. She is an interdisciplinary researcher whose work focuses on the intersections of identity and food security. She conducts participatory research with populations across the agricultural value chain to generate innovative solutions to complex global challenges in food security. She has a PhD in Ag Communications, Extension, and Leadership from the Ohio State University, and a master's degree in International Agricultural Development from the University of California, Davis. So please join me in welcoming Drs. Myers and Wilson to our webinar series. Rob and Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you. We'll get the slides up here and get rolling. So this is definitely a very interesting topic these days, what's going on with regenerative agriculture, and something, as many of you have been seeing, that's been attracting the interest of not only major companies, but farmers really not only across the US, but around the world. So what we wanted to do today is go through a few different aspects of regenerative ag, talk a little bit about why it's been in the news, how climate change is a driving force for many of the discussions about regenerative ag. Dr. Wilson's going to share some in-depth research she's been doing on different audiences' views on regenerative ag, and then we'll end with just a little bit on the Center for Regenerative Ag to let you know what we're up to these days and how we're approaching things. So in terms of the news, regenerative agriculture is just all over the news. And much of this started in 2020. There had been articles, of course, before then, but it just really blasted into the news in the year 2020. So we saw headlines like this one, some of them targeted to specific geographic areas where Cargill, Target, McDonald's, and Nature Conservancy were all joining together to do an $8 million project in Nebraska. General Mills has been in this for a while. They actually started providing funding in this area probably about 4 or 5 years ago. Many groups have launched soil carbon initiatives targeted to regenerative agriculture goals. Either they're trying to get to be carbon neutral as a company, or they're seeing opportunities to make investments in this space. Even the beverage industry, many of the beverage companies like PepsiCo have gotten into regenerative agriculture in a major way. Grain trading companies, some of the biggest ones like Cargill set a goal last year of 10 million acres, and ADM has touted their work in regenerative agriculture. Food companies like Danone. Now Danone we think of with yogurt, but they're actually a very diversified food company. They have around 100,000 employees, I believe. They've been one of the major players in regenerative ag, and doing it not only in the US, but in Europe. So they were one of the early ones starting in 2017, investing in the space. Kellogg's came on board a little more recently. Here's an article from just a couple months ago where one of their programs in regenerative ag is targeting rice production. In fact, Missouri rice producers are able to get incentive payments through Kellogg's for regeneratively produced rice. And that's just one of probably about a half a dozen different financial programs that our Missouri farmers can participate in for regenerative agriculture. Clothing companies, our Missouri cotton producers had an opportunity a while back to work with Wrangler Jeans on producing regeneratively produced cotton. So again, we see this across the board. Even this one really struck me, the National Law Review. I would not have expected the National Law Review to have an article on regenerative agriculture, but in all things, it was focusing on regenerative fashion. And this is not the only place this topic has appeared. New York Times recently had an article on regenerative agriculture and fashion. So it's just all over the spectrum of agricultural products. Besides specific industries, we're seeing just broad headlines like this one from Forbes, how regenerative agriculture is shaping the future of food. So think about that, a major financial magazine that wouldn't normally have a lot about agriculture saying this is, a major thing that's happening in the industry. In the ag media sector, this headline came out in 2020, or actually was in 2021 that the article came out. Regenerative ag, the #1 food trend. So we see big companies like Walmart, which of course is our biggest grocery store company across the country, has had major investments into regenerative ag. This one from just a couple weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, Burger King now announcing a new regenerative agriculture commitment. So you name it, whether it's companies like McDonald's and Burger King, the grocery store chains, Whole Foods, just about all these bigger food and ag companies have some sort of regenerative agriculture program. So I guess if you wanted to be a little cynical, you could say, well, this is just a buzzword, right? People have just latched on to the latest buzzword. And, these companies, well, maybe they're just doing it from a greenwashing standpoint. But I will tell you, I have talked to a number of these companies, vice presidents for sustainability, and they are all pretty passionate about this. Again, many of them are making multi-million-dollar investments, either doing grants to help educate producers to do these practices or incentivizing farmers by paying them to do these practices. Sometimes those practices are targeted to specific ones like cover crops, sometimes more broadly, maybe giving them a variety of options like pollinators, no-till, grazing systems. So, it's just showing up all over the place. And in geographic, we have it showing up here in California, the wine industry, the next big thing. This was just an article from a few months ago. And it's often targeted to the farmer side of things too. So West Texas farmers, you might not think that would be an area where regenerative ag would be popular, but looking at it as a way to fight extreme weather. And so this is something I hear a lot from farmers. They're very concerned about more extreme weather events, and they want to figure out ways to make their farms more resilient. Some farmers have been working at this for quite a while. Like Steve Groff, a farmer, I've been to his farm in Pennsylvania 3 different times, good friend of mine. He's written a book about it where he says farmers are becoming more aware than ever how to adopt regenerative practices that the market is demanding. And I want to emphasize that the market is demanding. So we tend, from an academic community to think about, well, what needs to be done for a variety of goals? What can we do from a research standpoint? But the farmers are reacting to the market, of course. And so that's where Steve was coming from with his book. Another well-known farmer in this space, Gabe Brown, I've been up to his place a couple times. He's very popular on the speaking circuit. Came out with this book last year, One Family's Journey to Regenerative Ag, been a very popular book. There was this headline just last month, a farmer, an ag company talking regenerative ag, coming together, Kellogg's, Syngenta, Nature Conservancy, some farmers. So one thing I have found interesting is, when I started my career, you'd maybe talk to somebody from a company like General Mills. I remember meeting with one of their vice presidents back in the 90s and talking to them about some alternative ag practices. And they were kind of interested, but he said to me, well, we don't really engage with farmers directly. And boy, has that changed. These companies, they're going out to some of these farmers that are doing regenerative practices to see their practices in the field. And I'm talking to company leadership, the CEOs, the vice presidents, or they're bringing farmers in to advise them. So it's really kind of changed how they're getting much more connected to the producers. I loved this image, kind of talking about how the companies are in many cases connecting this to climate change issues and looking to see how carbon can be put into the soil. That's really one of the essential aspects of what people are thinking about with regenerative ag. And again, I mentioned the resiliency angle. So just to pick a specific example, in 2019, we had this, very unusual weather system where it was just extremely wet that spring. And farmers that maybe normally would have been planting corn in April weren't able to plant till June. On my own family farm in central Illinois, our corn was planted 2 months later than it normally would have been. And it wasn't just late planting, there were 19 million acres that could not be planted that year. Here in Missouri, we had about 1.3 million acres that could not be planted. And that had a cost, not only to the individual farmers, but to us as taxpayers. It cost us as taxpayers $4.2 billion that year through extra crop insurance payments for that 19 million acres that couldn't be planted. And to put that in perspective, in a normal year, there might be 1/10 that, maybe 2 million acres that can't be planted due to weather extremes. So how do we deal with these very challenging weather situations? From that same year, this is a photo I got from a farmer in Oklahoma, and he farms on the left. He's been a long time no-tiller, several years of cover crop use, same soil type as the conventional field across the road on the right side of this image. And you can think, well, which of these farmers is going to get in the field and plant first? Which of them has a chance to get their fields planted and doesn't have to collect crop insurance because the rain is infiltrating because of that better soil health, the more resilient soil system that they have? This is an image that I like to use a lot from Ray Weil. He's a soil scientist, very well known at University of Maryland, wrote the textbook that's used in a lot of our undergraduate soils courses. And it shows what's happened to our soil organic matter over time. That on average across the United States, we've lost about half of it. Now, of course, that varies from site to site. But I know Dr. Neil Kitchen here, ARS scientist, in the building I work in with our cropping systems unit, he's found the same thing here near Columbia, that we've lost about half the organic matter. We've also, of course, lost quite a bit of our topsoil due to erosion. And so that's giving our soils less capacity to respond to these extreme weather events. But fortunately, as Dr. Weil showed in this diagram, if we change our management, we have an ability to start restoring some of that regenerative or resilient capacity to the soil. So I'm going to let Kelly do most of the definition of what regenerative ag is from her survey. This is just simply a word cloud from 10 different websites about a year and a half ago when we first started launching the center, looking at what types of terms people were using and describing regenerative ag, different programs around the country. You see things like soil, climate really pop out. We tend to think when we talk about sustainability or regenerative about practices, but I think we've come to conclude, and Kelly and I have talked about this a lot, that maybe it's a little more about outcomes. And so at this point, I want to turn it over to Kelly, and Kelly, go ahead and bring up your slides and let her talk about what we're hearing from different people who are working on regenerative ag and their perspectives.
Great, thanks, Rob. Let me just grab your screen. Always doesn't go quite as smoothly as we'd like it to, does it? All right. Is that good? Everyone can see the screen?
We're seeing the presenter view, not the full view.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Not yet.
Sorry about this, everybody. Better?
Yes.
Great. Okay, great. Well, thanks, Rob. And yeah, so, you know, when I came on as assistant director for the Center for Regenerative Agriculture, I had been steeped in agriculture, working with a whole range of farmers, really across the globe and in the US. But although I've been really steeped in kind of sustainable agriculture, I had to kind of figure out for myself what I thought regenerative agriculture means. Maybe I shouldn't say that in front of Rob, but so as part of that, I decided to do this study where I really wanted to understand from these different stakeholders who are using the term regenerative agriculture, what they mean by it, why we're hearing so much, and what it means to the different people who are using the terms. So, you know, kind of following up on what Rob was describing, we've really seen this surge of attention on regenerative agriculture. This figure from a 2021 article shows how different food and ag key terms have kind of showed up, and just that surge in around 2019 regenerative agriculture, both, you know, across different key terms, but also looking at it on its own, just this like spike in publications in the news, as well as in peer-reviewed articles about regenerative agriculture. But of course, it has not been without its criticisms. And two of the main ones that kind of lead into what we're talking about is, first of all, that one of the biggest criticisms of regenerative agriculture, one of the things that most of us can agree upon, is that there is no agreed upon definition. So there's this great quote where it says, you know, a growing movement harbors a secret. No one really agrees on what regenerative agriculture should mean. So that's been a very consistent yet undefinable problem with regenerative agriculture. And another big criticism is really this idea that, well, it's just a buzzword, it's just another passing trend. And there's been plenty of criticisms around that, and whether it is different in some way than other words or other movements that have come before. So just to kind of give a little bit of that idea of like, well, what's the problem with it being a buzzword? Well, when we think about buzzwords, you know, they are something that come to us within a specific context in specific times. They tend to represent something that's trendy, in style, that a lot of different people are talking about. Because of that, they have kind of a negative connotation. They denote that it's hot right now, but it's a passing trend. So, you know, you kind of have a lack of seriousness with it. Another thing that's characteristic of buzzwords is that they are widely used, but not commonly understood. So there's not a collective understanding, despite that a lot of people are using it. And that allows a lot of different people to harness the word, often with very strong conviction. People feel very strongly about it, despite that we are talking about differently. I love this quote from Benson 2014 saying, buzzwords allow interpretive flexibility while being recognizable enough to enable people to translate and adapt them to their niches, which really goes further into, you know, even though a lot of people are using words, it actually can be it can almost be divisive. But at the same time, buzzwords can have a directing quality. And really what they're doing is trying to create buzz, right? Trying to draw people's attention to an objective. So if we think about other buzzwords in this space, we can think about the term climate smart agriculture, a very popular thing we're talking about a lot right now, or even zero emissions. So with this study, what we really kind of were thinking about is like, well, why does it matter that, you know, that these issues exist, that these criticisms exist. And first of all, for something very important is that, if we're really aiming to get resilient and equitable food systems, we need to be able to communicate across each other's experiences and across our different positionalities. It's also really important, just for transparency's sake, to be able to communicate and build knowledge, to be able to fund research, to be able to do that research, and then to be able to communicate that research across the food and ag value chain, and to consumers for that matter. And it's really important to be able to understand what we're talking about so that we can identify the opportunities to strengthen our collaborations. And the overarching goal is to really create more resilient and equitable food systems. So with that, we did this study where the kind of focuses were to examine how regenerative agriculture terminology is being mobilized and disputed by different actors. And within that, identify what the opportunities are within the buzz. Ultimately, to move towards a collective understanding of this idea. So this study was exploratory study I used to construct this framing, which means that you're trying to understand how different people understand an idea or a concept based on their own experiences and their positions in life. These were, I conducted 19 different in-depth qualitative interviews all over Zoom because of COVID, but between 45 minutes and an hour with each of the different participants. The population were farmers, individuals representing universities, so researchers, private companies, several representing the names that Rob mentioned earlier, and different nonprofits, all that are using the term regenerative agriculture or have been really experts in the spaces surrounding regenerative agriculture for a long time. We use proposive sampling to be very specific about, finding people who are using the term, who are experts in the field, and also, being very purposeful to not perpetuate past narratives that have come to fruition often, where there's kind of a whitewashing where white people tend to have the narrative of farming and of the people who farm. And so we were also propositive to ensure to include people of color in this study. For data analysis, we took the transcriptions and did use grounded theory to do inductive analysis, which means that instead of having a framework ahead of time, we allowed the themes to emerge. Because this is such a new space, we wanted to see what the themes are that were going to come out of what people were thinking about, how they felt, and so we allowed those themes to emerge. So I'm going to give kind of a brief overview of some of these findings that we think were key. Basically, there are kind of three overarching sentiments about regenerative agriculture. First, there were a lot of conversations about the difference between sustainability versus regenerative, which we'll talk about in a second. And then, as Rob mentioned, there was definitely a consensus around the idea that regenerative agriculture is necessarily outcome-driven instead of practice-driven, and that it's context-specific. So thinking about that idea of sustainability versus regenerative, there was a lot of different discussions with different sentiments with it, some kind of with a little bit of disdain about it, but some really feeling like this was a new opportunity. But basically the idea is that unlike sustainability, we want to regenerate that resource. We want to make that resource better. And how we steward those resources are going to dictate what they have available to them into the future. So that's why we see regenerative really as the vocabulary that we need to adopt. So instead of the idea of sustainability being something that we maintain, it's talking about improving, restoring, and regenerating resources. The two ideas of being outcome-driven and context-specific are quite tied. Basically, the fact that instead of focusing on practices, for example, how organic has standards that are practice-based, the kind of shift to thinking about outcomes means that we can provide more opportunities to be adapted to a specific context. And so depending on your context, different practices may be used to achieve that target. And we heard this, across all different types of participants, that, it is necessarily outcome-based, outcome-driven, and that according to your context, that is what really makes a difference, or that is how we can figure out what the appropriate practices are to achieve those outcomes. The kind of second piece of this was these themes that came. What are the outcomes? What are we talking about? What are the things that we are aiming at? And these, again, quite preliminary findings or analyses here, but they kind of fell into three categories. First, there was the climate adaptation and mitigation. A predominant theme of that was focused on building soil health, although these other area terms and area ideas came up a lot. And this is really important, although a lot of participants also said that when they're talking to different people, different farmers, they won't necessarily use the term climate change, even though that is a very underlying value. Another important thing is that it's about integrating systems. And so that had to do with mimicking nature, increasing biodiversity. For some, regenerative agriculture essentially integrates crop and animals, for some, not so much. And then really interestingly, there's really a focus on outcomes related to social progression. So those, were all these different sub-themes within there, from having more quality products for health and nutrition. Much of them were focused on farmer success and resiliency, thinking about the economics, ensuring that if you're using regenerative agriculture, you're still able to support your livelihood, but also into the future. There's a lot of emphasis on community resilience, rebuilding our rural communities, rebuilding, boosting and stimulating the energy and connections within communities. And then something really important that is really important in regenerative agriculture is that there's a focus on social justice. And so participants are really reckoning with how to avoid past mistakes of excluding and making invisible the contributions that Indigenous people, Black and Brown people have made to agriculture, and learning how to kind of acknowledge and be better at bringing to the table those voices who have been really honing, a lot of peoples who have been honing this knowledge for a long time. And so we can benefit from the wisdom as well as be better at acknowledging where that comes from. So kind of like to wrap up this in a brief way, we also talked a lot about what are the opportunities within regenerative agriculture. And these are the things that were brought up, but also kind of where I'm at with where I see regenerative agriculture as still a really good opportunity and not just a buzzword. The first is that there is so much attention around this area and the idea that we want more resilient food systems, and it's coming from all these different entities that have a ton of different negotiating powers and a lot of negotiating power. And so that's something that's really important that is worthwhile mobilizing. Second, that I really loved hearing about is that right now, regenerative agriculture is still considered a big umbrella or a big tent. It's still considered quite inclusive. So there aren't kind of a narrow scope of, oh, you fit into this idea of what regenerative is. Of course, some participants had some more narrower views, but generally there's this idea that you can kind of dip your toe into regenerative agriculture to see what's working for you. And that's a good place to be in. And a lot of participants felt like that's an essential place to be in, especially when we're trying to reckon with climate change, trying to reckon with creating resilient and equitable food systems. There's certainly a call for interdisciplinary and systems-based research, which is so tied to those ideas of being outcome-driven, but moving those outcomes beyond the important things of soil health, water quality, air quality, biodiversity, but also being inclusive of the really important social factors, because ultimately, humans are stewards of the land, and it's really important that we consider and respect them and us. I am one of them as a person. And then there's this great focus on people that, has been a part of other movements before, but is certainly central to the idea of regenerative agriculture. And so, as I've been talking about, it's about kind of centering equity, learning how to acknowledge and better understand these different farming practices that have been brought to us with new research, but also, well curated and honed research from generations. And that's kind of an essential part of what regenerative agriculture is. But of course, much work is needed, and it's kind of an exciting time for us in that way, because with these calls, with this opportunities, there's a lot of ways that different stakeholders, from researchers to nonprofits to farmers to private companies, can be involved and be a part of that change. And so that's a really exciting place to be at. So that's kind of where I'll wrap up that, my presentation of the findings for now. So Rob, did you want to show a little bit about the the website. You're still muted, Rob.
All right, there we go. Too many windows open. So just the last few slides here. One thing we look at with regenerative agriculture is many of the farmers talk about comparing it to nature. So for many of them, biodiversity is a part of it. When we think about our prairies or our forest, not only the plant biodiversity that existed, but the grazing herbivores, the soil ecology that was a much more biodiverse community. How do we have systems that can take us there? We also hear more from farmers about trying to combine conservation strategies. So not just putting terraces on the land, for example, but integrating those terraces with perennial covers, with cover crops, with no-till, with riparian buffers. So this is a common element we see, is not only thinking about biodiversity, but looking at the overall landscape. And for many farmers, it comes down to that soil health component. How do we build soil health? As part of that, how are we sequestering more carbon? So both an adaptation and a mitigation strategy when we're looking at climate change. So putting these things together, we did develop a fairly in-depth website. I know many of you have seen, but just in case you hadn't, just to briefly take you to that, and while we talk a little bit about our work, and then we'll get into the discussion period here. So we have put this together to appeal to a variety of groups. So we've got information for farmers, getting them interested in not only the soil health component, but how they can integrate crops and livestock, try to make their farm more resilient. We also recognize there are a lot of absentee landowners that are interested in this topic, but maybe don't know how to get started. They may be unfamiliar with some of the government programs or private sector programs, may not fully realize how this could potentially affect their land value and what their opportunities are to work with their tenants. We know a lot of farm advisors from different groups, whether it's Extension, NRCS, agencies, or the private sector, are trying to work with their clients. So putting this together, and then also the consumers and companies and why they should be engaged with this. So people can get in here and either go to our resources section to get at practices, or just here on the main page. We have identified 9 kind of common practices ranging from cover crops and grazing through agroforestry, pollinators, buffer strips, biodiverse systems that people can get into, and then get into some of our resources. But just as importantly as those information resources is the people we're working with. And Kelly and I are really pleased by the response we've had from so many faculty. We have over 40 faculty that are collaborating now. So if you're not yet a collaborating faculty member and would like to, we'd love to have you. There's no particular obligation other than we'll get some of your information. We link to your own page, provide a short summary about what you do. So take Ashley Conway here, a little bit of information about her research, then you can go into the full bio. But this is a way for us to know who on campus, when there are research opportunities or grants, or possibilities. Many of you know we're just now finishing up a $26 million proposal to the USDA's Partnerships for Climate Smart Ag on behalf of Kafner. I know we'll have other big opportunities we'll be pursuing on behalf of interdisciplinary teams here. So we'd welcome your involvement with the center, and just reach out to Kelly or I if you have questions or have interest there. So again, this is a place you can point people to who may have some questions about regenerative ag, or browse yourself. We are trying to gradually add more in terms of events and activities. We'll have a number of programs going on this summer, and just pleased to have a chance to visit with you today, and look forward to the discussion here during the question period. So Shabu, I think that wraps up the presentation. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Rob and Kelly. So we will open it up for questions now. And please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat room. And I will repeat the question, and then you can respond. I don't see any questions yet. So please post your questions in the Q&A box. I'm not
I
really
think Tim has
monitoring
his
the
hand
chat
up.
session. Well, I will start off with a simple question there, Rob and Kelly. So I'm glad to see all the excitement about regenerative ag and particularly from the private sector. So apparently they are willing to invest literally, hundreds of millions of dollars. So what has been the response from the ag community, from the producers? What is, in other words, what is the adoption rate?
I think initially farmers were pretty intrigued with signing up for some of these programs, but what's happened is we've had such a flood of programs launched from the private sector, let alone some of the existing government investments, that the farmers are just like, well, I don't know which one to sign up for. So I mentioned there are several in Missouri. I probably lost track of how many, but just for example, Syngenta will pay you to do cover crops or no-till in Missouri. Bayer will pay you to do cover crops or no-till. I mentioned Kellogg's has a program for rice production. Wrangler has had cotton. I'm not sure if that one's still available. And Indigo Ag is another one. So there are several that are available just in Missouri. And the challenge for farmers, and I know some of the folks on the audience here have looked at the soil carbon programs, is that programs all vary. It would be one thing if everybody was offering the same payment structure, but they have different payment approaches. It varies. If you sign up for 5 years, maybe one company will be better in year one, but another will be better over the lifetime. Others have a floating amount they pay based on what happens to the carbon market. So it gets challenging, but at the same time, farmers are very interested in regenerative ag. They're attending meetings, webinars, field days. And so despite the confusion about all these soil carbon programs, there's strong interest because they're seeing the same thing we are in the media. Kelly, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would add that, having talked to these, I've been pleasantly surprised to learn about the different pilot programs from especially the different participants of the study, in that they're really, first of all, coming at it from a very systems-based and integrative approach. So they're really trying to think about farmer success and livelihood, in addition to, in a lot of ways, wanting to meet their net zero goals, their commitments in terms of addressing climate change and creating more sustainable food supply chains, for that matter. But what they have all said is, and a lot of these programs are still in pilot programs, is that they have plenty of people signing up, and so it's not been an issue of that. But there's really a need for the kind of labor around farm advisory, and a lot of that is actually third party, and so there's a lot of working with third parties to provide that training and extension and education, which is quite crucial when it comes to like any types of transforming your farming system, any types of adopting new practices or trying to achieve new outcomes. And so they're saying that really there's a need to be building up those structures, to be creating more labor in those ways, which is a great place for us as at Kafner, right? To be having those ag educators and those ag extension folks getting into the field and getting more, people as they're coming into agriculture, young adults coming into agriculture, knowing that there's a lot of space for that, and there's a lot of demand from private companies as well as certainly government at this point too. So yeah, it was kind of a long-winded way to say that there is a lot of confusion, especially around carbon markets, but there seems to be a lot of interest and a lot of like more support than I think there may have been in other past programming.
All right. Thank you both. I see Tim Reinbart with a raised hand. And so Tim, please unmute yourself and please go ahead and share your question or comment.
Can't hear you, Tim.
Tim? Well, he dropped his hand. I don't know, maybe.
Okay.
But I have a few questions here in the.
Oh, apparently they can't unmute themselves.
Unmute ourselves. Okay, let me see what I can do here. I'm so sorry. I don't see any option for me to do that either here. Let me see.
Try now. Please try now.
Okay, Tim, you can try now. Okay, I apologize. Again, it looks like it's not working, Roundup. But while we are working on technology, let me read at least one of these questions from the Q&A box. So what future work research could we expect to see from the Center for Regenerative Agriculture in the next 5 years?
Well, initially, just based on some of the grant funding we had right out of the gates, quite a bit of our work's been on cover crops and soil health, but we have big ambitions to partner with many of our colleagues in animal science and agroforestry to do more integrated approaches. I see there's a question in the queue from Jordan Thomas, and I think there's really exciting opportunities, especially for Missouri, given that so many of our farmers have diversified operations that include both crops and livestock and often woods and tree opportunities to look at more integrated approaches, maybe compared to some of our neighbors like in Iowa or Illinois. So I'm very excited about what we can do in that space. Kelly brings also some social science dimensions. So Kelly, do you want to say anything about some of those aspects of research?
Yeah, I think it's exciting to be able to be looking at things as like a system, and that's not just the biological system, it's also the people that create that system and catalyze those systems. And so certainly, we're working not just alone, but, with other research organizations as well to try and figure out what these outcomes are, are the most important things we're trying to focus on, and how do we validate or verify them. And that's a huge thing that is the work that is needed right now. And we're working on that, whether it's with soil health, but it's also different ecosystem services, along with figuring out ways to make sure that our food and ag systems are working for us. And I mean that in like the world of us, not just certainly Missourians, but also other people, other farmers, other eaters across the globe. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and we're excited to be a part of that.
Okay, thank you both. The next question is, well, first of all, thanks so much for a great presentation. A lot of the discussion here was about farmers within the US. I would love to hear a bit more about how regenerative ag can be a big umbrella, either in terms of geography or in terms of location within the value chain.
Kelly, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great question. So actually, I'll say that compared to several areas of the world, the U.S. is a little bit late to the game with regenerative agriculture. It's already boomed in a lot of different areas. Australia is certainly ahead of the term, and of course, I work with a lot of farmers in African countries. And while maybe the term regenerative agriculture isn't used, so a lot of the wisdom and practices and outcomes are a big focus already. And so it's kind of, there's been in the U.S. kind of it's great to see this focus on farmers in a way. But I think it's a good question in terms of geography, and also, it's not just farmers. And I did poke each of the participants that was a private company representative about, like, it's not just farmers that we have to be talking to about this, right? And so, like, what are the other things that are happening? And I was again pleasantly surprised that there's a lot more going into creating more sustainable supply chains in terms of the packaging being used. There's a lot more thought going into how we're moving things across the world. And I'm not saying that that it's perfect or that all the solutions are there, but I really appreciate this comment, because there seems to be that focus on farmers, but there is other thought going into what that means in terms of a value chain that's regenerative, and it's really important.
Okay, great. Well, I have another question here. So that is, well, it's from Jordan Thomas. Thanks, Kelly and Rob, for your presentation and all of your good work. Do you think there is a negative stigma in academia about regenerative ag that needs to be overcome? What steps can faculty and administration take to address that? So,
yeah,
go ahead.
Interesting. I don't think it's so much of a negative stigma as maybe a well, this is just the buzzword like Kelly was talking about. And, I think any of us in our academic careers, we want to work on things that matter. We want to have a lasting impact. And you might think, well, is this just a fad that's going to go away in a couple of years? Why should I get involved in this? I really think this is going to be with us. I go back to my own roots in sustainable ag. And I remember I gave my very first seminar on sustainable ag when I was a PhD student in Minnesota. This was 1986, so 36 years ago. And I remember one of the faculty at the end of my seminar saying, "Oh, gee, this sustainable ag, this kind of sounds like heaven." And then not 2 years later, I was working on Capitol Hill's Congressional Science Fellow, organized the first congressional hearing on sustainable ag. And it was a Missouri congressman who came in, and he's kind of listening to the discussion, and he says, "This sustainable ag stuff sounds like communism." So, it takes time for people to find the center of what a new area is. And I think regenerative ag is still kind of finding its center, but we're recognizing there are certain outcomes we have in common, that it's connected to climate change, which, ultimately, this is the central sustainability challenge of our time, right? Climate change. And so we're not going to solve that this year or next. We're going to be battling this for whatever portion of our careers we have left. And we all need to be doing things to contribute to it. So I think there's much we can all do. The thing I would end on is something Kelly brought up, which is, none of us wants to be categorized as a reductionistic researcher, but let's face it, our disciplines in agriculture have tended to stray towards the more narrow perspective of working in our discipline. And I think the great opportunity we have for regenerative ag is, how do we do more systems-oriented research that can address the challenges that producers are having, that consumers are wanting us to answer, that help us address climate change. And Shabu and I were talking yesterday, and I reflected back on something I heard as a young scientist. That was a very well-known biophysicist at Caltech University. My college roommate was doing a postdoc with him, and he said, the advances in science happen more at the interfaces of the discipline, but then by just sticking in your own discipline. It's when you kind of bring together those diverse perspectives that you really gain insights that help us advance our knowledge and understanding of the way the world works. And I think that's where we're at with regenerative ag. If we can work more effectively together across our disciplinary boundaries, it can be not only exciting research, but very powerful and fundamentally important research. So thanks for that question, Jordan.
All right. Well, thank you, Rob. And I'm going to play the devil's advocate here because I have a question. Well, I will just summarize. Do we really need another word besides sustainability? I still don't understand the difference yet. Well, I think,
Yeah.
Kelly, you tried to really differentiate, but you may want to emphasize, again, what's the difference between sustainable agriculture or sustainability versus regenerative?
Yeah, and everybody brought up that there's this idea that it's, sustaining was just about maintaining, regenerating is about improving or restoring. And so when we're talking about our soil base and how it's degraded, instead of just like maintaining that, it's about restoring. Some folks said that with wholehearted, some people said it, well, sustainability was also about that, which kind of gets maybe at your point. It's very similar. Something I really appreciated from a few of the participants was that people just seem to resonate with the term. Like it's a term, when you hear the idea of regenerative, that word seems to be making sense to farmers and to different actors. Just the idea of regenerative agriculture seems to be resonating and making sense to people. So maybe there is something in that sentiment that is different. And again, we're in the moment we're in, and so we want to mobilize the attention that we have to go towards these objectives of something good, I think.
Okay. Well, so I have another question here. Do you foresee urban agriculture as being part of this regenerative ag?
Yeah, it's such a
Go
good
ahead,
question.
Kelly.
I don't think that I initially thought much about it, but more and more as I am, learning, growing my network in Missouri, certainly I am seeing all these amazing things that are happening in urban agriculture. And it's certainly learning how to create systems that work together, because they're small spaces, and so it has to be quite productive. And so I've been really impressed by what's happening, and I do think that it takes all farmers, it takes all of us eaters, and all of us working here. And so I don't think that I think that big umbrella idea is really important to think about, and that it's not just these farmers. It really is encompassing and trying to figure out the best ways for all of us to be contributing towards addressing these outcomes.
Okay, great. Well, Tim Reinbart finally put a comment here in the Q&A box. So Tim was going to ask about incorporating livestock being critical, but I think, he believes that, Rob, you addressed that as part of one of your responses. So do you have any additional comments about that, Rob?
Well, I think the thing I'd add, and I've talked with a number of you that are on today and welcome everybody's insights, is, it's a simple thing to say, well, we need to integrate crops and livestock, but what does that really mean? Well, when we look at our 10 million acres of row crop production, we look at the number of beef cattle and other grazing animals we have in Missouri, we're seeing evidence that when we can, for example, bring beef cattle onto a cover crop field and graze those, that we can improve soil health more quickly. We get more economic productivity from that land. We have probably, it appears, some water quality benefits. So I think we're still understanding what all the impacts are, but it's a very exciting area for interdisciplinary research. And so I know Tim recognizes that, and that's why he's bringing it up. But I just wanted to say that for those of you that may not have given as much thought to that, this is a really interesting opportunity for us in Missouri, given our mix of enterprises we have in the state.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Kelly, do you want to add anything to it?
No, I think that's great. I mean, we could also say that, integrating plants and animals could also mean integrating those great pollinator species, so it may not be that not everyone's going to have livestock, and I think that's okay. But it's trying to increase that diversity of crops and plants and animals, and that thrive together, I think.
Okay, very good. Well, we are nearing 4:30, so I think it's time to wrap up our webinar for today. So let me thank Rob and Kelly for an informative talk and leading a lively discussion. And thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. Our next webinar will be next week, April 28th, next Thursday, the same time at 3:30. We will have Dr. Pei Liu, a faculty member in the Division of Applied Social Sciences, joining us as the speaker. So thanks, everyone. I'll see you next time.